Many years ago, I came across a franchise by the name of Dungeon Keeper. It was a game where you were the overlord of a dungeon, or rather the keeper of a dungeon, hence the title Dungeon Keeper. And what you did was you dug out like little square rooms or rectangular rooms, and you placed tiles in those rooms to denote what kind of room that's supposed to be. It's a game that has since reached a sort of cult status among people who know what it is and enjoy it, but for some reason we haven't seen any real follow-up to Dungeon Keeper 2, and I can't help but wonder why that is. How's it going, everybody? My name is ingeniousclown, and Dungeon Keeper 2 is one of my favorite games ever. In fact, I go back to replay it somewhat regularly, maybe not every year. I don't have time for that. It can be a pretty long game, and I get really into it, and I lose hours and hours and hours to it, because there's just something magical about just creating the dungeon in your own image. Now, I'm gonna have some footage of Dungeon Keeper 2 here in the background, so you can kind of see what it's like. And if you want to buy it, you can go buy it on GOG.com for relatively cheap. I was able to pick it up for like under $3, and I think normally it's about $6. It's a lot of fun. But if you're not into the kind of games where you're kind of at the behest of the AI of the creatures inside of your dungeon, then you might not like it. But for me, this is a genre of games that I, for some reason, am really drawn to. I really like these like top-down simulation kind of strategy games where your strategy is mostly in the layout of what you control. I'm not really into it now, but when I was really young, SimCity on the Super Nintendo, I really liked that for some reason, and even though it was outside of my demographic as a stupid little 8-year-old, Sim Ant was a title that always intrigued me. I loved the idea of it, but for some reason the game kind of sucked and I couldn't really get into it. But I loved the idea of it, and I remember being so sad that I couldn't make it work in a satisfactory way for my needs. And then comes along Dungeon Keeper and Dungeon Keeper 2, and I just absolutely fell in love with those games. I look back on them fondly, and like I said earlier, I go back to play them many times. But it's all about laying your dungeon out in a way that suits you and suits your strategy, and of course is a winning strategy. You need to decide how big each room is going to be. You need to kind of make sure that everything is kind of where it needs to be, where things are close enough, where things that that need to be a little more protected aren't like at the edge of your base because you don't want the enemies to come in and steal it. There's just a lot of little nuance and a lot of little strategy that goes in to kind of figuring out what you want to do with your dungeon. It's not the hardest game in the world, but it's very, very satisfying. And there's a lot that you can do with it. And I mentioned at the top of the video that there hasn't really been a true follow-up to Dungeon Keeper 2, and you might be wondering, but ingeniousclown, what about War for the Overworld? That was created by people who love Dungeon Keeper 2, probably even the original developers. It has the original narrator even. While that game is great, and I'm glad that it exists, and I'm glad that these people who made it were able to come out with this game and give us more of what we love, while I'm glad for all of that, it's basically more of the same. Don't take that to mean that there's something wrong with more of the same. It's something that I think this genre needed, because not a lot of people really know that it exists. And this got the genre, the Dungeon Keeper kind of genre, the dungeon creator, the dungeon lord, the dungeon architect genre, I don't even know what to call it. It got this genre out to more people where it would have otherwise just not have been known by anybody, other than the people who knew about it originally. That's great and all, but it's just the same thing as Dungeon Keeper. And what I'm kind of hoping for is a little bit more of an evolution. And there's one other game that comes to mind when it comes to dungeon building and not controlling your creatures. And that is just a game that is just called Dungeons. Now, Dungeons is a game that just kind of sits in a very weird place for me. I remember seeing it on Steam when I bought it, looks like about 5.5 years ago, according to my Steam library. I saw it on Steam and I was like, oh my god, we finally have a real follow-up to Dungeon Keeper 2. I'm so excited! And then I went and bought it, and that game was not what I wanted it to be. Unfortunately, I can't tell you exactly what it was, because I've kind of mostly put that game out of my mind. I tried really hard to like it. because I thought it was what I wanted. I thought it was supposed to be the follow-up to Dungeon Keeper that I've been wanting for quite a while at that point, but it just wasn't. You created treasure rooms and you tried to lure heroes into traps and stuff like that. It wasn't like the cool fighty strategy where you have creatures that do cool stuff and you could send all of your creatures into a pit to fight each other to the death just so they can get XP to fight the enemies later on. There was none of that. It was just like this purely kind of vanity-focused experience, and it just didn't have that same ring. But that's the closest that I've seen other than War for the Overworld. But now, let's get to the main point of the reason why I wanted to make this video in the first place, is that it seems like we're finally going to get some sort of follow-up to Dungeon Keeper. And I don't mean just like more of the same. I mean something that takes this genre of having creatures and indirectly controlling these creatures and building your dungeon and laying out rooms into a strategically advantageous way. I'm talking about that kind of style of game. We're finally gonna get a sort of follow-up that's not just another Dungeon Keeper clone. It has a lot of similar elements to Dungeon Keeper, but it's not just Dungeon Keeper, if you understand what I'm trying to say here. This game is Empires of the Undergrowth. A handful of you probably discovered my channel through my Empires of the Undergrowth video, which I think is sitting about 27,000 views right now. And for good reason. It's a brand new game in a genre that people are hungry for, especially since EA just took the franchise of Dungeon Keeper and just took a big old steaming crap on top of its corpse. Never gonna forgive EA for that. I think everybody has something that they're never gonna forgive EA for. That's mine. They took that franchise and they unceremoniously executed it. And it made waves in the YouTube community, but the waves were small, unfortunately. But yeah, a small indie developer by the name of Slug Disco is creating a game about ants that is very much in the vein of Dungeon Keeper and Dungeon Keeper 2. Now, of course, it's not Dungeon Keeper or Dungeon Keeper 2, it's completely different. You have even less control of your creatures as you did in Dungeon Keeper, but that's fine. It's in the same genre, and it's finding a way to differentiate itself and not fall into the trap of being just another Dungeon Keeper clone. Because I think we've had enough of that by now. I mean, we've only had really War for the Overworld, but that's all you need. We need this genre to expand. We need this genre to grow into something wonderful and independent. We need this genre to grow into something that can inspire more game developers to just create more awesome stuff. There's so much potential in this subgenre of strategy games, and I, for one, am excited to see what Empires of the Undergrowth is going to become when it's finally released. Right now, it's only in alpha, and there are public alpha builds available, and while there isn't a lot to do in this current alpha build, it shows the potential of this kind of game. The controls are very limited, the number of units are very limited, but the game, in its alpha state, has still managed to capture the imaginations of so many players. What I thought was just going to be another video that has just a couple hundred views tops ended up getting a couple dozen thousand instead. Lots of videos of this game that I've seen are getting way more views than that channel usually gets on any of their videos. And that says one thing to me, which is people want more of this genre. So game developers, if you're listening, if you have the ability, if you have the desire, there's a hole here that needs to be filled. Just don't fill it with ants. Somebody's already doing that, and they're doing a pretty good job of it, if I do say so myself. Anyway, I'm excited for this. I'm hoping what this indicates is the growth of this genre. Finally. Maybe we'll see more of these. I really hope we do. I'm really excited. So that's gonna do it for this video. I'm curious, have any of you that are watching played Dungeon Keeper or Dungeon Keeper 2? I'm curious to know what you think of the genre and kind of what you would like to see in future games in this genre in the future. So if you could just leave some of those ideas in the comment section below, I would appreciate that. And if you're interested in watching some gameplay of Empires of the Undergrowth, you could head over to my Let's Play channel. There's going to be a end card at the end of the video, so you can click on that to be taken over there to see it. And finally, don't forget to do all the social media stuff. Like the video, dislike the video, follow me on Twitter at ingeniousclown, and hit that subscribe button for more awesome gaming content here in the future, and I will see you next time, Keeper.